Okay, we are recording now our third Zoom session on 240 compression. Looks like Audra's back again. Good stuff. All right. And Angela was asking me about a question that she was having trouble with, but we never really quite figured what that is, but we will. Let's take a look at today's topic. It's Unit 2. So last week we covered linear versus compression in general, and we talked about and last week we did some practice with some input-output functions, and some of the practice questions were taken directly from the textbook. I believe it's an appendix of the book, and there's questions regarding Chapter 7, and those are what we went over last week as our practice questions. What we're doing today now is addressing the two main types of compression. There's a fork in the road, okay? And that's why I'm doing, hey, peace, brother, because one's output limiting compression and the other one's wide dynamic range compression. So all compressions are not created equal. They are defined by their knee points and by their ratios. You shall know them by their fruits. Okay, the knee point is the when of compression. At what input does the hearing aid go into compression? And the ratio is the how much compression. Once it's applied, how much? So the higher the ratio, the greater the compression. The less the ratio, the weaker the compression. So compression was originally developed to imitate linear hearing aids, okay? It was put on fairly high power hearing aids, and what it did was these hearing aids provided linear gain, but then instead of using peak clipping to limit the maximum power output, instead it used a high degree of compression, a high ratio of compression, and that was called output limiting compression. It's a close cousin to linear, albeit instead of using peak clipping, it just uses a high degree of compression. And the two words to know for output limiting compression are high and high. High knee point, high ratio. In other words, it waits to go into compression until the output is a certain amount, and then once past a certain amount, and then it slams on the brakes. And so the focus of output limiting compression is limiting the maximum power output of the hearing aid. The focus is the ceiling. The focus is the sky. They want to prevent more hearing loss, okay, by limiting the MPO. You're giving the guy a hearing aid, but you don't want to give him more hearing loss due to noise-induced loss. So this is the whole thing. So output limiting compression came first. It was the first horse out of the barn. And it was seen as a real cool thing to have because the hearing aid didn't distort as much because peak clipping is, okay? Wide dynamic range compression came way later, at least 10 to 15 years later. And what separates WDRC from OLC is wide dynamic range is found on weaker hearing aids. And it's meant for sensory neural loss. In other words, mild to moderate, when the damage is due to the outer hair cells only. And as you recall, the outers amplify soft sounds below 50 dB so that the inner hair cells can sense them. The outer hair cells are talking with the brain, and they are getting information to stretch and shrink and sharpen the traveling wave and amplify the traveling wave for soft sounds. So in outer hair cells, because they are mechanical, they die first, leaving you with an inability to hear sounds below 50. So you're with a mild to moderate sensory neural loss, the most common hearing loss in the world. Well, you're not worried about the ceiling there because the hearing aids are weak. They're not trying to put out a whole bunch of power. Okay, you're worried about limiting the MPO when it's a high power hearing aid for a severe hearing loss. And that is a neural hearing loss. In other words, the damage isn't just due to outer hair cells, but now you've got inner hair cell pathology as well. So outers leave you with about a 50 dB loss when they are damaged, an 80 dB loss, and you know if you could open up the cochlea, you'd see damage to both sets of hair cells. Outers die first, then inners. Sometimes they die at the same time, and that person usually, if he has a mild to moderate loss, and it's due to both sets of hair cells having damage, that person will have lousy speech discrimination. But the person with a mild to moderate loss who has good speech discrimination, like 80% or better, usually if you could open up his or her cochlea, you'd see the damage was to the outer hair cells. And that guy or that woman would wear wide dynamic range compression. Has a low knee point, low ratio, low and low. Lo and behold, okay, and the compression is at a low knee point, so low you can't get under it, and the compression is so wide you can't get around it because the hearing aid's almost always in compression. It's only giving linear gain for really soft inputs. And already with average speech inputs, it's already compressing. The knee point's like at 40 dB, 30. Okay, so you're only getting linear gain for soft inputs. Why? Because you're trying to imitate the outer hair cells. You're imitating them deliberately, what they used to do. Now you've got a hearing aid that's electronically trying to imitate in outer hair cells. How? By amplifying soft sounds. So the focus of WDRC is exactly the opposite. It's on the floor. You're trying to lift the floor. You're trying to amplify soft sounds. What sounds? Sounds below 50. Your whole concentration, it's like a Inspector Clouseau with a magnifying glass. It's looking at the ground, whereas OLC is looking at the ceiling. They are opposite types of compression. And that's what I'm trying to address here. That's why we've got this unit. And that's been the whole stream of my textbook, Compression for Clinicians. I'm always dividing hearing loss, sensory neural loss, into two camps. And chapter 2 in the book deals with sensory neural loss. Chapter 3 in the book deals with neural sensory neural loss. And then you've got fitting methods, which are addressing both sets. But all of a sudden in chapter 7, you've got compression for severe loss, compression for mild to moderate loss. And you're following those same two strains again. Oftentimes I see a lot of people just talk about conductive loss and sensory neural. Well, I'm breaking sensory neural into two camps on purpose. And it's not me who originated that. It's Harold Schucknecht, the ear, nose, and throat physician who examined and who came up, and when we studied anatomy and when we studied disorders 125, you learned about Schucknecht's 4 types of presbycusis. One was sensory, one was neural, the other one was strial, okay, blood supply to the cochlea. Sensory was outer hair cell death. Neural was inner hair cell death. Strial was stria vascularis, blood supply problems, and that person usually had a flatter loss because the damage was equal across the frequencies because of the lack of blood supply, and that's more common in women than in men. Remember all this? And then you have the mechanical presbycusis, which is kind of like a garbage can, and it's the types of presbycusis that don't really fall into the above categories. It might be an overly stiff basilar membrane or an overly stiff organ of Corti or what have you. But basically, this is what I'm trying to hone us back down to. Okay, so let's now look at our notes and look at our screen and read from the top, yeah? All right, here we go. Here's your PowerPoint. Here's your good old linear gain. You can see in this example, it's 60 dB gain. I just picked 60 just for fun. Do you ever have it that numbers are colors to you? They are to me. Numbers look like colors. I'm serious. Like 5s are yellow, 6s are reds, 7s are blue, 8s are brown. You could ask me a year from now, I'll give you the very same thing. Isn't that weird? I have yeah, what do you, Angela? I can't hear you because your mic is off.
I think that numbers are male and female.
Ha! Good, okay.
1 is male, 2 is female, 3 is female, 4 is male, 5 is female.
Isn't that interesting? See?
And I say the same thing.
Weird associations. Audra's probably going, okay, you guys are nuts. Okay. Okay, here we go. So you're looking at linear gain. You can see the 45-degree angle, 1-to-1, peak clipping, not allowing anything out. The first type of compression was like, whoops, This. Okay, OLC, output limiting compression. Instead of this, you got this. You have a high knee point and a relatively high ratio. And compression ratios that are more than 2 or 3 to 1 are high compression ratios, really. Because look at my input went up by 20, my output only went up by like 5. Okay, so that would be a 20 to 5 or a whatever, a 4 to 1 compression ratio, I believe. So anyway, now, before we go there, let's look at our notes. Compression in general. Focus of this unit, okay, OLC versus wide dynamic range compression. Compression in general, focus in this unit on the history of compression development. Many of the topics below are incorporated in today's digital hearing aids, buried beneath the surface of the software. So you won't be encountering all of these as you are fitting hearing aids in your future courses, as you are doing your clinic, as you program RIC hearing aids according to whatever, from whatever company. You're not going to see all of this. A lot of this is buried underneath the software. A lot of it is. But compression is often called automatic gain control, meaning different amounts of gain for different input levels. And that is why many of today's hearing aids don't have volume controls. You don't need them, okay, as much. The hearing aid's going to give you more than half gain for soft sounds, around half gain for average speech inputs, and less than half gain for loud inputs. And unlike the linear hearing aid wearer, who's constantly adjusting his or her volume control, because the hearing aid is giving the same gain for all inputs, okay, until it peak clips. So if the hearing aid is supposed to give like 50 dB of gain, it's going to give 50 dB of gain to a 10 decibel input, and it's going to give 50 dB of gain to a 50 dB input. So for a whisper, it may not be enough. He's going to crank it up. For average speech, it might be perfect. He's going to turn it down. For loud, it's going to peak clip, so it's going to turn it down so it doesn't distort. So he's always adjusting his volume. Compression used to be called automatic gain control. Okay, the purpose really of WDRC especially, and you might want to write this beside where I'm graying this out here, especially for WDRC, the purpose is to fit a big dynamic range of sound inputs into a smaller one. Okay, and I'll show this with my hands. Here's a normal dynamic range, soft at 0, loud at 100. The guy with hearing loss can't hear until 50, yet 100 is uncomfortably loud. Still with me? Good. The purpose of WDRC is to fit a big dynamic range into a smaller one. Okay, so the guy can't hear 0, he needs 50 to just barely hear. So WDRC is going to amplify 0 by a lot, but it's going to amplify 50 by less. It's going to amplify 100 by nothing at all. Okay, because you're trying to fit a big dynamic range into a smaller one. So the focus is on the floor. It's going to amplify soft sounds by a lot and loud sounds by little or nothing at all. That's the whole fighting cavities used to be the whole idea behind Crest. Well, that's the whole idea behind WDRC. So the purpose, sensory neural loss, has a reduced dynamic range, so you cannot mirror the audiogram with full-on linear gain. With sensory neural loss, and you learn this in 150 fitting methods, and you'll learn this again next semester when we cover real ear, because I'm teaching that course, and half of the course is on fitting methods. So you're going to visit this again, okay? With sensory neural loss, the ceiling is the same, but the floor is raised, as you know, and loudness growth, normal hearing versus sensory neural loss. Compression reduces the need for volume control because it automatically changes gain for different inputs. You could always tell a linear hearing aid wearer because the person was constantly changing his or her volume control. All right. Now, here's something that you don't find anymore or today on it's in the digital hearing aids, okay, but it's done automatically. And I'm not going to ask people, I probably won't put any questions on a quiz or final about input versus output compression, but I want you to, I'm going through this to drill home how to read the graphs. It's deadly important that you can read a graph, because that's what separates audiologists from the run-of-the-mill HIS. Okay, it really does. And audiologists kind of look, well, hey, they don't know how to read that stuff. Angela, you had a question. Yes.
Sorry, I have to unmute me.
Oh.
I found out what that was. It's called TK adjustment.
Yeah, TK. We'll go over it.
Is that what we're doing right now?
We're going over it today.
Awesome.
We're going over that puppy today. All right, here we go. So it used to be that analog hearing aids were either input or output compression, as well as WDRC and OLC. But I'm not going to ask you. What I want you to do is look at the graph and make it your business to read the graph. Watch this. Output compression was called AGCO, and it all dealt with what happened with the volume control. With output compression, when you adjusted the volume control, you changed the gain, but you didn't change the MPO. Okay? And that was great for high power hearing aids. Now recall, the rightmost gain line is the least gain. And how do you know that? Well, let's just do a little exercise here. If I have this much input, look where my cursor is, and then I get this much gain, my output is going to be here. This much input is going to give me this much output. I'm taking the numbers away. There's no numbers on there. Just I'm doing it conceptually, okay? If I increase my gain with my volume, it means I need, look at this line here, way less input gives me almost the same amount of output. Remember, input plus gain is output. So reading the graph, the rightmost gain line always represents the least amount of gain. The leftmost 45-degree angle indicates the more linear gain. Okay? Then you had a hearing aid called input compression. This was found on weaker hearing aids, where you didn't care so much that when the listener adjusted his volume control, the MPO stayed the same. Okay? You didn't care as much. So here, when you adjusted the volume control, you changed not only the gain, but you also increased the MPO. They changed together. And if you look at this in terms of a frequency response, on ANSI testing, let's say, output compression, here would be your MPO, your maximum power output. And as you adjusted the volume with output compression, you changed the gain. But with input compression, as you increased the gain, you also increased the MPO. So this is showing you in terms of a frequency response, and the previous picture is talking about the very same thing in terms of input-output functions. On the left is always AGCO, on the right is always AGCI, and it was just to tell you that there were different effects with the volume control that were built into analog hearing aids. Today, this all happens automatically. In digital hearing aids, when the input is soft, if you adjusted the volume control, you'd adjust both the gain and the MPO. When the input is loud, if you adjusted the volume, you'd only adjust the gain and not the MPO. So you don't have to worry about picking one of these today. The digital hearing aids today automatically go into one or the other, okay? But on analog hearing aids, they were either this or that. And look at the bottom of the picture. It depended on where the volume control sat in the circuit. If you put the volume control here, this was its effect. If you put the volume control after the amplifier, it had this effect. So it's engineering. Okay. And if you were to listen to the difference, if you were listening, you'd have to speak softly into both while adjusting the volume. Notice the volume would go up and down. Obviously, gain is affected by both input and output compression. Okay, both, look at the blue, okay, obviously. But if you spoke loudly into the hearing aids, both of them, while adjusting the volume, notice the volume would stay the same with output compression. And this is because the MPO is not affected by the volume control. If you were yelling into the hearing aid, input, like a lot of input plus a lot of gain, okay, you could change that, but it would never affect this, because you were hitting MPO already. And in output compression, the volume doesn't change the MPO. In output compression, the volume control doesn't change the MPO. And that's how you hear the difference between the two, okay? Notice with input compression, if you yelled into the hearing aid, still, if you raise the volume control, it would get louder because the MPO was adjusted. You were hitting MPO, but volume control changed the MPO as well as the gain. So enough on that. That was just sort of an exercise in history. Here's where the knife cuts the cheese. Okay, here we go. Output limiting compression versus wide dynamic range compression. On the left, high knee point, high ratio. On the right, low knee point, low ratio. Can you see on this picture how wide dynamic range compression is in compression for a wide range of inputs, whereas output limiting is in compression for a smaller range of inputs? So OLC has its focus as the ceiling. Wide dynamic range has as its focus the floor, because it's providing linear gain for those soft inputs. That's what you wanted. That's what you're after, okay? And if you are describing that, what's happening here in terms of frequency responses again, output limiting on the left, watch what happens. For soft inputs, you might be providing a lot of gain. For average inputs like 60, the same, lot of gain. Watch this now, okay? Whatever the gain is here, 60 in, 40 in, 100 out, 60 in, 120 out, okay? So the gain remained the same for 60 inputs and for 40 inputs. The gain remained the same for 40 and 60 dB inputs, but suddenly, with a loud input like 80, suddenly the gain went down. Well, with a loud input like 80, suddenly the hearing aid went into compression. Okay, so one's talking in Polish, the other one's talking in German, but they're just telling the same story. The hearing aid is high power, and when it goes into compression, it really goes into compression. And it waits until the input is a lot more, because only with a louder input will the loud input plus the gain hit the MPO, and then the hearing aid slams on the brakes. Witness here. Again, 60 in, lot of output. 40 in, lot of output. Suddenly 80 in, the hearing aid is slammed on the brakes. So in a frequency response, now the gain went way down with an 80 dB input. Now look on the right. On the right. 40 dB inputs give you a lot of gain. 60 dB inputs give you less gain. 80 dB inputs give you even less gain. This is like the old lady in front of you, not the teenager slamming the brakes in his dad's car. This is Mrs. McGillicuddy seeing the stop sign way down the road, and as she ever so slightly puts on the brakes about a mile ahead of the stop sign, pissing off everyone else behind her. Okay, watch what it looks like on an input-output function. Whoops. Lots of linear gain, but it's a weaker hearing aid. Remember, it's a weaker hearing aid. So 0 in, 40 out, 20 in, 60 out, 40 in, 80 out. So my linear gain, albeit less than over here, but it's linear, but the most gain is being provided for soft inputs. And then at a knee point of 40, now the hearing aid goes into compression, but a weak degree of compression. A 2-to-1 ratio. My inputs increased by 20, my outputs increased by 10. Input goes up by another 20, output increases by 10. So it's and what's going to happen with this hearing aid is you're going to give most gain for soft inputs, progressively less gain for louder and louder inputs. And the mental image you can think of this is kid in his dad's car, racing down the road, slamming on the brakes just before the stop sign. This can be the little old lady going down the same road, but slowing down way before the stop sign, and not slamming on the brakes, but gently, gently slowing down. Wide dynamic range compression, output limiting. High power hearing aids, weaker hearing aids. Neural sensory neural loss, sensory neural loss. I hope this is kind of coming together. Okay? Now let's look at what Angela was talking about, the TK adjustment and MPO adjustment. In other words, how were these two hearing aids adjusted? When you adjusted their compression, what happened? Okay, what's the adjustment doing when you're playing around? Now, I'm not talking volume control. How is the compression adjusted? Well, just like when we go home, here, you can raise or lower this peak clipping, right? I can make it occur at 110. I can make it occur at 100. I can make it occur at 130. Okay, it just depends on where you, the clinician, set it. And you chose this based on the guy's uncomfortable loudness levels, right? Recall, okay? So if the guy's UCL was 100 dB HL, you probably would set this at around 115, 120, because basically the difference in SPL and HL is about 15 to 20 dB. So basically, and hearing aids are read that way in terms of dB SPL. So okay, now let's go to where we were talking about. Oh, here. How would you adjust the compression here? Well, you take this whole line. Let's see if I can just do that. Why don't I just do it? Woo, okay, I'll take this whole line right there. I will copy it. Let's see, copy, and I will paste it. There you go. You'd probably set it here. You could do this. Or you could do this. Of course, I'd have to, your gain line would go up here, but you know what I mean. You could raise or lower that, just like you did, like you could do here. Same thing. Okay, so how is output limiting compression adjusted? By raising or lowering the MPO, as I just showed you. Okay? So because your concern is the ceiling, you do this, you're the clinician, you're looking at the client's uncomfortable loudness levels, and you are setting the maximum power output of the hearing aid according to what you want because of the listener's loudness discomfort levels. And you're setting the MPO on an average around 15 dB greater than the guy's UCL or loudness discomfort level in dBHL. Okay, because hearing aids are in SPL. Here's the adjustment done on WDRC. It's different. You're not concerned with the ceiling. Okay, you couldn't give a rat's butt about the ceiling. The hearing aid's weak. What are you adjusting here? You're adjusting the amount of gain for soft sounds. And that was called the TK adjustment. That's what they called it. Okay? You are adjusting the threshold knee point from here to here to here. This would give you the most gain for soft sounds. This would give you less gain for soft inputs. This would give you even less gain for soft inputs. Why would you want to adjust this? Why wouldn't you always want the maximum gain for soft inputs? How come? Why would you want less gain for softer inputs? The answer is because many times the person listening to the hearing aid would say, in dead quiet, my hearing aids really bug me. In dead quiet, I'm hearing too much ambient room noise. That's because in dead quiet, the hearing aid is giving you the maximum gain. As the inputs increase, the hearing aid's backing off, remember? So in dead quiet, you're hearing ambient noise, you're hearing internal circuit noise of the hearing aid because it's giving you the most gain in dead quiet. And the person doesn't like that, especially if the person has good hearing in the low frequencies. That person was often able to hear internal hearing aid circuit noise. And that is why on wide dynamic range compression, they made an adjustment as well, but the adjustment was the infamous TK control. And that was done again. You'd think you'd always want the maximum gain for soft inputs, but untrue. If the person had good hearing in the lows, the person would complain that ambient noise in dead quiet, the hearing aid was amplifying too much. So you would want to deliberately move this line to here, or move it even further to here, to decrease the amount of gain you were getting for soft sounds. So the TK adjusted the amount of gain for soft inputs. The MPO adjustment on OLC adjusted the maximum power output, and it dealt with loud inputs. Okay, it dealt with the ceiling. This one's dealing with the floor. So that's a very important concept to internalize and to grasp. So here we go, input versus output. Don't worry so much about it. I went through that in order to give you practice on reading the graphs. Read this though, in analog days, clinicians had to know which one was which, because the hearing aids were either input or output. Today, the hearing aids, the digital hearing aids, automatically go into input compression for soft inputs, and they go into output compression for loud inputs. So it's no longer a big deal to know. Okay, but it's the history of compression that Chapter 7 really covers. Chapter 8 in my book really looks at compression as it is used in today's digital hearing aids. And we're going into that in the second half of this course after the midterm. The first half is really history. Okay, so you need to know, you should have an idea of what input compression is. Basically, it meant that the volume control adjusted the gain and the MPO together. Output compression meant that the volume control adjusted only the gain but not the MPO. And output compression, this input versus output is completely independent of whether the hearing aid is output limiting compression or WDRC. That's a different dimension, a different plane. Okay, you could have OLC on input or output compression. You could have WDRC on input or output compression. So we're looking at two different planes here. Input and output compression dealt with what does the volume control do. It's all about what does the VC do, nothing else. And then when you're looking at output compression, output limiting compression, or WDRC, that's the big fork in the road in compression. Okay, and OLC, output limiting compression, the adjustment is the MPO. WDRC compression, the adjustment is the TK control. The MPO deals with the ceiling, the TK deals with the floor. All right. Categorization is the essence of intelligence. I firmly believe that. Okay, so when you're looking here at the bottom of page 1, you can see OLC versus WDRC, and you'll see a lot of what we said already. Now let's just read it together. OLC is a way to limit the ceiling of output for severe hearing loss, usually found in high-power hearing aids with lots of gain. You need to carefully control the MPO to suddenly stop it from increasing whenever necessary. You don't want to cause more hearing loss with the hearing aid. OLC was the first type of compression to appear in analog hearing aids. It came out in the 1980s. Actually, it's like a close cousin to linear hearing aids. It's a lot like linear hearing aids. The MPO is its main adjustment. The main difference is that instead of using peak clipping to limit the MPO, it used high compression ratios. How it works, top of page 2. Think high and high. High knee point, 60 dB SPL or more. The hearing aid provides linear, read most gain for soft and medium inputs. High compression ratio, greater than 4:1. Once the hearing aid goes into compression, it goes into a lot of compression. You can see that compression takes place for a narrower range of loud inputs. The focus is on just what it says, to limit the MPO or ceiling so that it does not damage the client's remaining residual hearing. It's a sudden limitation of the output to protect against further hearing loss, like peak clipping, but without the distortion of peak clipping. Next paragraph, WDRC, on the other hand, was a way to lift the floor of hearing sensitivity for soft inputs, for moderate sensory neural loss, originally used on analog low-power hearing aids, emerged around 1990, long after output limiting compression. It emerged when the role of outer hair cells and otoacoustic emissions was better known. The 1990s was the golden age of compression. Hearing aids were still analog, but clients had to know their compression. And I'm going to just kind of stop sharing for a second and just look at you. So you look at me, okay? We have become dumber and dumber. Our software does everything for us, okay? We have done a frontal lobotomy. I'd rather have a bottle in front of me than a frontal lobotomy, okay? We no longer know our compressions. We no longer know how they work. Here's how we fit hearing aids today. Do you have trouble hearing the preacher every second Sunday at a distance of 45 feet at a 33-degree angle every second Sunday? If so, push this button. You don't even know what the hearing aid did. You're just blindly believing the software, worshiping it, okay? And it's just kind of like, what? So people no longer focus on compression because the software just does everything automatically. And we've become dumber and dumber because we've let the manufacturers control us totally. They've got us completely in their hands. The fitting is all psychosocial. It's all, is your client a librarian? Does she like quiet? Is your client a construction worker? Does he like loud? Let's make the hearing aid have a loud format. It's just kind of like, what? So we've become really strange. The 90s was really cool because hearing aid software had yet to emerge and clients had to know their compression. They had to know it because if you ordered the wrong hearing aid, it was the wrong one. He's like, WDRC isn't output limiting, and output limiting isn't WDRC. They're different animals. One's a zebra and one's a giraffe. Well, now the software combines it, and guess what? They still use WDRC. They still use output limiting. All of that stuff is still used in digital hearing aids, only when we never look at it, we just let the software do the talking and the walking. And we are HISs, we need to know what's going on. Not that you're fitting with input-output functions all the time, because I said there a lot of times they're buried. You're not using it all the time, but as clinicians, you gotta know what's going on inside that hearing aid. And guess what? The hearing aid will automatically be WDRC for soft inputs. And if it's a weak hearing aid, it will stay WDRC for most of the time. If it's a higher power hearing aid, guess what? It's going to use a combination of the types of compression, and it's all going to be going on under the surface. The trouble is today, we don't look at that anymore, but it's all going on. And you can see it when you're fitting the hearing aid. You'll see it when you're doing real ear. You're going to notice the hearing aid give lots of gain for soft inputs and less and less and less gain for louder inputs. And if you don't know compression, you don't know why. You're just going to be going, huh, isn't that weird? A 10 dB input, I'm getting a whole bunch of gain, but suddenly with louder inputs, all of a sudden I'm not getting any gain anymore. Well, no shit, Sherlock. It's using WDRC. Duh! Okay? You need to know what that stuff is. That's why we're teaching a course like this. So you don't come out like the typical IHS grad saying, duh, because they don't know. They're sitting in the back of manufacturers' talks trying to figure out what's going on, and they get snippets and bits and pieces, but they can't tie it together because they've never had a real decent formal education describing it. Okay, I'll get off my soapbox. Next. Okay. Notes. So we're almost done this section. I mean, I'm painting with broad strokes here. Here's WDRC emerged later, how it works, what it does, think low and low. Low knee point, and the hearing aid provides linear, most gain for only the soft inputs that are below this low knee point. It uses a low compression ratio, less than 4:1. In other words, it's in a weak degree of compression most of the time. And the hearing aid is in compression for a wide range of medium to loud inputs, albeit a weak degree of compression. Whereas output limiting compression is in a strong degree of compression, but only for loud inputs. Okay? The focus of WDRC is just what its name says. Compress a wide dynamic range into a smaller one. A unique type of compression that tries to imitate the outer hair cells. It tries to elevate the floor by providing linear, greatest gain for soft inputs below the knee point. And this is the Angela stuff. Compression adjustments, MPO versus TK. We already went over it. Okay? OLC uses MPO adjustment. Raise or lowers the knee point, which in turn raises or lowers the maximum power output. Okay. Raise or lower this red bar. Make it here, make it here. You're changing the maximum power output of the hearing aid. MPO adjustment was the first type of compression adjustment. It's been around for over 30 years. Compression was seen as a way to limit the MPO without distortion by peak clipping. In analog days of hearing aids, output limiting was used along mainly with output compression. The clinician set the MPO according to the listener's UCL, and then the client could adjust the volume control till the cows came home, because that didn't change the MPO. You set it. You're the clinician. You don't want the guy to get further hearing loss. You know his UCL, so you are setting the MPO accordingly. And then the client could adjust his volume control. And remember, with output compression, the volume control did not change the MPO. You set it. All it changed was the gain. And again, the clinical uses of it was mainly for severe to profound hearing loss. The rule for setting the MPO, it's a lot like the MPO control on linear hearing aids. Set it about 15 dB above the guy's UCL. Because UCL is measured in dB HL, and hearing aids are measured in dB SPL. And the difference between HL and SPL for most of the speech frequencies is around 15 dB. That's why. Okay? And then you have the TK control adjustment. That was the newer type. It was found on WDRC. Audiologists, believe it or not, didn't know how it functioned. They were used to MPO adjustments only. They didn't get it. I remember working at Unitron Hearing Aids, getting phone calls from irate, angry audiologists. And they'd be telling me, you won't believe this, your hearing aids suck. Because when I'm talking into the hearing aid and I'm adjusting this control, nothing happens. I'm going, well, it's because it's a WDRC hearing aid. Okay? TK doesn't affect the gain for louder inputs. Shut up. Don't say anything. And now adjust it. What is that? Oh, you're hearing the ambient room noise get louder as you're adjusting the control. Well, what's that for? Because I'm trying to imitate the outer hair cells. I'm amplifying soft sounds. Okay? So when you're talking, you're already at average inputs. The hearing aid is already in compression. Adjusting the TK, you can go and do that all night long. You're not going to hear anything because the TK adjusts the gain for soft inputs. Okay? So just kind of just rounding off with common sense here, and then we can go home. All right. So WDRC uses the TK adjustment, which raised or lowered the knee point, which in turn raised or lowered the gain for soft sounds. It adjusts the floor. As the knee point gets higher, the gain for soft inputs goes down. The whole focus of WDRC was to imitate outer hair cells. Increase the gain for soft sounds so that they become audible. To hear the effect of the TK control, be quiet. Let quiet ambient room noise into the hearing aid and listen while turning the TK control. You'll notice the gain go up and down. All right? That was the way you heard it. Clinical uses of WDRC for mild to moderate sensory neural loss. This is the most common type of hearing loss. And so the TK control had a huge application, and so does WDRC. The rule for setting the TK control: set the knee point as low as possible until internal hearing aid hiss sound becomes audible to the client. This is often especially evident for people who had good low frequency hearing. WDRC amplifies the most in quiet. Today's digital hearing aids use both. They'll use WDRC for soft inputs, output limiting for loud inputs. Your input-output functions will often show 2 knee points, but that's for after the midterm exam. Basically, I'm done this section. Paint with broad strokes. Okay, divide your compression into 2 types. Divide your sensory neural losses into 2 types. Today's digital hearing aids combine everything, but if we don't know our past, we will be condemned to repeat it. I didn't make up those words, but someone I think named George Santayana did, some philosopher. But I was a philosophy major in college, so why don't I just borrow, beg, and steal the words? Oh, lucky me, we're done here at 20 after 2 my time, 20 after 4 in Central Time. And guess what? I get to go to the dentist. Oh, yay. Great. The drill. You know the drill. All right. Any questions? Audra's going, oh my God, no. Sometimes, you know, when I would look at cars, and you'd sometimes see this, I don't know, on some cars, I'll show you. And I was so nerded out when I worked at Unitron Hearing Aids. I'd see symbols like this, either like on a Nissan or something like that. And I go, oh, that looks like output limiting compression. Or it looks like, you could tell I worked at a manufacturer way too long. Better get out in the sun, Ted. There's other things. All right, it's been a slice. Next week we'll go into the next unit. What unit was this? This was unit 2. So next week is unit 3. Okay? Yep, this was unit 2. All right, I can't hear you, Angela. Your mic is shut off.
Okay, so we're not doing 2 weeks per unit?
Not this one. We're done. You reached the end of your notes.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, that's it, Skipitsky. Unit 1, we took 2 weeks. Okay? Unit 2, we've done this puppy today. Unit 3 is next week.
Okay.
Hallelujah.
Yeah.
Live long and prosper.